Lee Arts today for the keynote speech in our 9th edition of the ICCTS. And Professor Arts, who has his PhD from University of Iowa, is a professor of media studies and director of the Center for Global Studies at Purdue University Northwest. He has published 10 books, including Pink Tide, Media Access and Political Power in Latin America, which came out in 2017, Global Entertainment Media 2015, The Media Globe 2006, Cultural Hegemony in the US 2000, and he also has published over 50 book chapters and journal articles on international media, cultural hegemony, and democratic communication. Professor Art's new book is coming out, in fact, this fall, and the title of that book is going to be Spectacle and Democracy, Transnational Media and Global Culture. He regularly speaks on global media, popular culture, media hegemony, and political economy of the media, and he was very kind to accept our invitation to be the keynote speaker for our conference. Today, his talk is titled US Media Framing of Conflict in the Middle East, Human and Environmental Consequences, in which he will speak about how commercial media frames the US occupations and interventions in Iraq, Afghanistan, Syria, and all across the Middle East. So thank you very much for being here, Professor Arts. I will leave the floor to you now, and I'll just remind the participants here that you will be able to ask questions and post comments at the end of the talk by using the Q&A function on your screen or by raising your hands. Thank you. Here.
Thank you so much for that. I'm really happy to join you. I was at Kadir Has for your conference 2 years ago, and I had planned to come last year, but of course, things got in the way, and I hope to come again. I'm very pleased to offer you a presentation for your consideration. As was explained, I want to talk about media framing of conflict in the Mideast and its human and environmental costs. I'm going to occasionally, I assume that you can see that, I will occasionally share a screen with you, but not completely. I will mostly not, but I thought it would break it up a little bit. Also, some of the statistics that I have to show would be helpful to have the screens. So I want to begin with my understanding of communication. I know often it's explained as the transmission of information from one to the other, or the need to inform the receiver from the sender. I prefer to see communication as a social process where we construct and share meaning together. That, I think, helps us understand how media framing works and why it's so important to consider media framing when we're looking at geopolitics and conflict, terrorism, and society as a whole. Media framing is the way that media select and interpret events and facts to construct meaning. There is nothing specific in the events themselves or the selection of the facts in the events that give us meaning. That has to be constructed. And what the media do is define events that happen. They would like to diagnose the causes of why these things happened. Who are the participants? Then they provide an evaluation of those agents. Are they good actors? Are they dangerous? Are they a threat? And ultimately, they end up with talking about which actions are preferred to respond to the causes and support the particular action that seems to be the outcome of how they've selected and interpreted meaning. Now, this is not an easy process. And what I want to talk about a bit today is some of the techniques. Robert Entman has written widely, and others have, on framing and what its function is, but not a lot of people have written on what are the actual techniques that allows media to frame the news. I identify here several, and I'll be speaking about 2 or 3. One is the selection of sources. Which sources will be used to help me explain what's happening in this particular event? What will be the descriptors? How will I evaluate the sources that I quote or cite in my news report? want you to understand something. It's not that I have to distort or provide fake news. It's simply how I'm going to frame it. So a frame is like a window. If I'm looking out the window here, you're seeing that building in the background, and you will see windows and the structures and maybe the sidewalk. But if I go over here, you're seeing the Bosphorus, you're seeing water, you're seeing ships. Both of these things are true. But as I adjust the frame, you get a different perspective on the world. And that's the dilemma that we have as citizens, as viewers, as readers, because journalists are assigned to events by publishers. They're trained, they're vetted, they're demonstrated their ability to follow certain frames. And in the process of selecting certain information and then interpreting it for the reader, it provides a frame, which is what constructs the meaning. And because it's the media, that's shared widely through television or through print. Ultimately, we could say frames construct the justification for actions, including violence, conflict, and the war. These particular techniques are very important for us, and that's what I will be looking at a bit today, is by choosing which sources, the officials, the allies, not the casualties, not the people that are defined as enemies. Occasionally there will be a citizen, as long as that citizen selected echoes what the official is. I did a study not too long ago on the Israeli occupation of Gaza, and I noted that the New York Times presented both Israeli and Palestinian perspectives. But when they would present the Israeli, it would be the officer in the Israeli Defense Force. When they would present someone from Gaza, it would be someone from Hamas, comma, a terrorist organization, another comma. So whatever followed that had already been evaluated as something that we should not listen to. So they use the selected sources and then the definition or the evaluation of those sources. This has been clear for a long time. The war in Iraq has been going on for 18 years, almost as the whole life for many of you that are at this session. And we have a collective amnesia, I would say, with the media assistance. We don't remember that when the media began to frame the war in Iraq, it was all about defining it as a response to terrorism, a threat to civilization. The newscasters would come on TV, they'd have, in the US, they'd have a little American flag, so it became a question of patriotism. There were weapons of mass destruction that were about to wreak havoc on the entire world. That didn't last long. Once there were no weapons of mass destruction, there were no incubator babies, there was no connection to 9/11, there were no uranium documents, all of that has been discredited. So now what we find, the frames in the US media and most of the European media for that matter, is they continue to define it as a question of terrorism, but now it's kind of got the added inflection that this is a humanitarian responsibility of the US and allied forces to stay because they need to support civic society. There's a complete absence, for instance, in the New York Times of any reporting by Judith Miller, who got accolades and awards, and all of her news reports were inaccurate. Now we understand that it's framed as a mistake to have so many troops there, but it was required in response to the terrorist attack. The same thing is true when we look at Afghanistan. The tropes, the forms, the frames remain the same, that it's terrorism. Again, there's a collective amnesia that the US sent 100,000 troops, that they've been bombing for 20 years. There's been over 200,000 dead. The US backed the Mujahideen, and actually Osama bin Laden had aided the Taliban, and they're still occupying Afghanistan in violation of international law. But I would suggest this isn't amnesia or forgetting. It's selecting on the immediate spectacle of what happened yesterday. It's selecting the events that happened yesterday or this week, and those events continue to be defined as Taliban terror which is caused by irrational Islamism. And the purpose is to discredit and oppose that particular group, which means the war must be continued. The New York Times and Washington both had editorials in the past month that said the best way to peace in Afghanistan is to continue the occupation. I'm not making that up. It's almost hard to believe. And this is a bipartisan, both the Republicans and Democratic politicians agree. They want peace, but then they say, well, hold on, not so fast. That peace must secure US interests, which is very difficult to define. The other point I would make is by framing this as the US peace negotiation and the withdrawal of troops, it makes us focus on the troops on the ground, and we don't focus on the fact of the drone attacks and the airstrikes are primary reasons for the deaths. The violence has not been primarily with US troops on the ground, but it's the 7,500 bombing raids that were conducted last year and 7,300 that were conducted the year before. There's been more civilians killed by US drones and airstrikes than by Taliban. But if we frame it as a question of terrorism and response to terrorism, you can leave those things aside. As I said, this is bipartisan. The US government, whether it was Trump or Biden has not stopped drone attacks in Somalia, Kenya, or Yemen. And he's simply added a layer of a review process that does not apply to war zones. So the continued airstrikes and drones against Syria, Afghanistan, and Iraq continue unabated. But we don't see that in the newspaper because that's not how the events are defined. And this, I would say, incidentally, this is not simply the US, it's all of Europe. It's even in Afghanistan. Tolo TV follows the US government media policies and frames. And there was an article just published in the American Journal of Communication that concluded that all news presents frames that are favorable to their own political and corporate classes. And they looked at the US, Pakistan, India, and Turkey. What I want to do now in a short time is I want to compare Trump and Biden administration bombings of Syria. Trump's was in 2018, Biden's was just this year. I look at the New York Times because it's the largest newspaper in the United States, has 7.5 million viewers on their website and in their print, and the Associated Press, which is the largest global news agency in the world with more than 1 million readers every day and thousands of newscasters that use AP stories. I looked at the New York Times on the day after the bombing. There were 31 sources that had direct quotes or attribution to those quotes. Everybody from Trump to the Defense Department, to the Prime Minister of Britain, to the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons, a couple Congress people, the Syrian government. Out of 31 sources that the New York Times referenced, 25 of those sources were selected that voiced support for the airstrike. Only 6 criticized the airstrike as unwarranted and illegal. So this is the New York Times balanced reporting, 2 sides of every story. 4 times as many sources selected, defended, and justified the attack compared to 1 that questioned it. It's similar when we look at the AP for the same date, April 13th, 2018. They had 22 sources. Of those sources, Trump, the defense minister, Joint Chiefs of Staff, Syria, Russia, 20 favored the strike. Only 2 were opposed. In other words, the objective reporting of the Associated Press framed the story by selecting their sources with 10 times as many citations that said the strike should be supported, that it was justified. If we move on, the second part of the technique I would suggest is evaluations. How do we describe this? In almost every case, both the New York Times and the Associated Press gave declarative statements that indicated that the response by the US was warranted because of chemical attacks by the Syrian regime. They said, prevent more chemical attacks, stop the use of chemical attacks. We don't want a repeat of chemical attacks. This happened after the previous chemical attack. Russia failed to stop Assad using chemical attacks. The point is that that was never verified. The New York Times did have 4 adjectives that said suspected or alleged, but they had 25 references that simply asserted the fact that this was a chemical attack. The Associated Press was similar. They said 1 suspected attack, 1 apparent attack, but 15 asserted declaratives that said chemical weapons were used. I don't want to go in the long conversation on the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons. Just note that they weren't able to go to do their investigation the following day because the US bombed on the following day. So by the time they got there, that made the investigation hard. Maybe in the discussion, we can talk a bit about what they found or didn't find. But my point would be that even if they found something, even if it was proven, even if there was evidence that showed there was a chemical attack, I need to note that the US, Britain, and French airstrike was a direct violation of international law. The UN Charter says international use of force is only justified for self-defense or the result of an authorization by the Security Council. Neither one of those things existed. But again, the frame from the New York Times and the Associated Press did not say that. So what is the context? The context that they give us, there is no background. Is there a civil war? Why? When? What? There's nothing on that. There's nothing on the US funding of the Syrian opposition. There's nothing on the Pentagon militias fighting against CIA militias in northern Syria. What's the context here? There's 2,000 troops in Syria illegally. The US has had bombing raids in Syria for the last 7 years, destroying oil wells, water plants, roads, bridges, thousands of deaths. For us to get some idea of what this means, imagine Angola or Somalia had 2,000 troops stationed in the United States fighting against white racists, destroying police buildings, arsenals, disrupting meeting halls for white supremacists, hacking their tweets. That's the context for what's happening in Syria, but that's not what the frame is that we're presented. The changes in Syria followed the Arab uprising that removed Mubarak from Egypt, overthrew the Tunisian regime, and it was spreading across the US. And the last thing the European Union or the US wanted was a democratic regime in Syria. And they essentially began to support militias and humanitarian groups. The sources that were selected here favored military actions. The sources that were selected were evaluated. I believe I can show you some of these are the sources from 2018. The New York Times had 4-to-1 as many sources that supported the US attack and its allies. The Associated Press had 10-to-1 of the sources that indicated support for the attack. No voices from Syrian citizens, no voices from Iraqi citizens, no voices from the United Nations. But okay, that was 3 years ago. That was the dark days of America First. Now we have the promise of a more progressive, peaceful world under Joe Biden. Well, Joe Biden delivered within 30 days of him taking office. 1 month after taking office, Biden strikes Syria with a missile attack on February 25th. I looked at also the New York Times the day after and the Associated Press the day after and found a similar selection of sources and similar descriptors. The AP had 27 sources, 25 favored the airstrike, including 3 from the US Congress, that thought Joe should have asked for their support, but they agreed with it. There were only 2 opposed. This is the New York Times, this is the Associated Press. 23 sources selected. I mean, it's the Associated Press. They have 100 bureaus across the world. All they could find was 27 sources, and of those, 25 supported or defended the strike. There were only 2 opposed. One was Katieb, the militia, and the other was the Syrian government. Again, no UN voices, no militia voices, no Syrian and Iraqi voices. The New York Times was similar. The New York Times, however, had more people stationed in the Middle East. They had a reporter in Beirut, in Amman, and in Baghdad. So they had presumably more opportunity to talk to regional sources. They found 25 sources. There were only 3 US officials, but there were 3 from the Carnegie Mellon think tank, 3 from the Chatham House think tank in Britain, 8 Iraqi officials. Altogether, there were 18 sources of experts and officials that supported and defended and explained the reason for the airstrike favorably. There were 3 sources that provided simply data on the deaths, the number that were killed and where it happened. In other words, the New York Times had 5-to-1 selected sources that applauded and accepted and justified the attack in a country that the US was not at war with, from a country that the US is illegally occupying. But the descriptions don't help us understand that. Their descriptions are, this had to take place to stop the risk of future attack by terrorist militias. That was a warning to stop Iran from interfering. Again, stop Iran from interfering. No frame at all the fact that the US continues to bomb, occupy, finance, train militias against the Syrian government. Everything was framed about the Iranian intervention. In fact, 1/3 of the column inches in the New York Times was devoted to news about Iranian-backed militias in the rest of the Middle East. They tell us that Hezbollah in Lebanon threatens Israel. They have 100,000 missiles pointed at Israel. They explain to us that Hamas in Gaza threatens Israel. In both cases, they admit that Hezbollah and Hamas are elected government officials. They talk about Iran backing the Houthis as they struck the Saudi airport. They omit the fact that Saudi Arabia is responsible again for an illegal international war that's devastating Yemen. And then finally, they talk about the Iranian-backed militias that attacked the Erbil airport. They omit even that the group that they bombed was not the group that they claimed did the attack at the Erbil airport. In passing, also, we don't have time to talk about it. One of their sources is the Syrian Observatory for Human Rights. They identify it, again, as a conflict monitor. Everything that was associated with the militias, who are actually part of the Iraqi official military and are fighting the terrorists, ISIS, are not described that way. But the Syrian Observatory is described as a conflict monitor. It's interesting because the New York Times did a report several years ago that noted that the Syrian Observatory is funded and subsidized by the European Union and gets money from the Foreign Commonwealth Office. It's explicitly opposed to the Syrian government. It's not a monitor. So there's a complete missing of any historical context. It's certainly not February 15th and the killing of a US mercenary. It's certainly not the Iranian-backed militias. The context is opposition to the US occupation in Iraq and Syria. The New York Times, I will share my screen one more time. To help us understand this, the New York Times gives us lots of photos. This was photos from the 2018 attack. The New York Times also provides us with lots of details, again, because it's the question of the spectacle that's newsworthy, not the question of the context or a balance of sources. Instead, they inform us with all of their details. Oftentimes, they will have graphics of the weapons that were used. In this particular story, they had color graphics of where the attacks were taking place and where the US would respond. I would suggest that these frames, by selecting the sources, by providing pictures of victims, maps of the attack, descriptors that make sure we understand which sources should be listened to and not listened to, and then not providing any historical or geopolitical context, allows that frame to have some distortion of the information the world public has. These same media frames that normalize US intervention omit coverage of the environmental consequences of war, with scant or no reporting on pollution, the destruction of the infrastructure for energy and clean water, destruction or contamination of agriculture, and the inadequate resources that would be available for an environmentally sustained recovery. War causes migration. The UN says this year there are 80 million refugees in the world. There are 22 million people that live in Syria. 400,000 have been killed in the last 7 years. There are 6 million refugees, and you probably know better than I do that there's 3.5 million Syrian refugees in Turkey. It's an amazing accomplishment, I would say, for Turkey to be able to, whatever the conditions are, to be able to provide shelter to 3.5 million refugees. There's been destruction of refineries and wells and roads, the loss of shelter, food, clean water, medicine, which is why there are so many refugees. There's been air pollution from the toxic fumes and chemicals. There's been soil pollution. There's been water pollution. In some of the refugee camps, especially I noted in Greece, there's been deforestation and a destruction of wildlife as the people that are in those refugee camps need firewood to stay warm and look to the wildlife to be a source of protein. So we know that there is not media coverage on the environment because media looks for ratings. Ratings means things blowing up, spectacle, drama. The environment does not always provide that spectacle. They may show the explosions, but the consequences are not newsworthy. There's been a destruction of water access in Syria and Iraq and Yemen and across the Middle East. The UN reported a year ago that there's 1.5 million people killed every year from water pollution. But that's not newsworthy unless conflict comes from it. The Associated Press in March this year had an article on how the pandemic will affect water delivery, but nothing on how the war destroyed water filtration plants or sewage plants. Nothing on pollution or the water treatment or the ecological effect. Nothing about the drought and dams on the Tigris that are affecting water security in Iraq. We get it. The journalists that are assigned to cover the war are not assigned to cover the environment. That's not their assignment. It's not reported. But if we remember or realize that after the guns fall silent and all the news media leave, after the bombing stops and the population goes out, they're not returning to some normal life. They're returning to a life that's got polluted air and water and soil. The pumping stations, the treatment stations, the sewage plants have been destroyed. The irrigation systems have been bombed and destroyed, so food production is disrupted. One of the very few media sites that addresses climate and war is the Chronicle of Middle East and North Africa. It's a Dutch online independent journal. I'm going to just show you a few of the things as we. They have noted that fires by ISIS, the US occupation of Syria, the US bombing of storage tanks and refineries, after the bombs, the oil spills in creeks and lakes, the debris that remains and its toxic debris, and the effect of the conflict has in the middle of climate change. There's other terror that I think that we should talk about. This is, after all, a conference on conflict, terrorism, and society. And I would say we need to look at economic sanctions as violence, as a form of state terror, because sanctions, one, not only violate international law and human ethics, but they also cause an increase in poverty, malnutrition, health, and affects the environment. The US occupation of Iraq, for instance, has ended up with Iraq draining the Mesopotamia March, which is a World Heritage Site. But it was done with the direction of the United States to improve agro-industry opportunities and oil exploration. So we have the environment in Mesopotamia, the cradle of civilization, that is now parched, desolate, uninhabited, a destroyed ecosystem. We end up with the frames of conflict that use sources, use descriptors that blame terrorism, that justify intervention and occupation, that feature the spectacle of bombs exploding in the air, or the technology, like both the New York Times and the Associated Press do. They always emphasize the media event that has just happened right here. Avoid any particular historical, political context that will allow us to make sense. And in that process, they avoid the human and the environmental consequence. This threatens life today in Syria, Afghanistan, across the Middle East, and Latin America. It threatens life now and in our short-term future. It threatens the existence on this planet. Last year, the UN reported that you are the last generation before planetary collapse. We need to get over the illusion that humans are separate from nature. Get over some perspective that the world can be divided into neat little newsworthy categories: economics, politics, culture, ecology. The global system of transnational capitalism cannot do otherwise, because capital must continue to expand, and the gross domestic product is a measure of social success. But the planet is finite, resources are finite, life is finite. For the rest of us, the answer is not corporate profit. We need humanity, human solidarity, and a sustainable relation to nature. But media frames conflict, war, the environment, as if each individual event is unique and separate, as if the negotiations between the Taliban and the US will secure peace, or as if the Israeli occupation can be ended through a negotiation with the Palestinians, that each fire or drought or flood or hurricane is a singular event, or that the environment can be protected by us buying an electric car or recycling plastic bottles or using reusable bags, as if these individual actions will save the earth. Corporate drive for profit creates inequality. Inequality creates resistance, and resistance prompts violent repression. There is a direct relationship between occupation and resistance. There's a direct relationship between poverty, austerity, and resistance. And there's a direct relationship between all of those things and the environment in which we live. It's not a bunch of evil white guys with cigars in a room plotting control of the world. Rather, it's corporate professionals and commercial media constructing meaning, spinning frames of irrational dangers threatening consumer society, and our primary concern should be individual consumerism. We know that the tobacco industry, the soft drink industry, the United States State Department, all of these have hired researchers, hired educators, hired physicians to downplay the particular danger. But they continue to mine and drill, refine, ship, manufacture, and everything else is referred to as an externalized good or an externalized cost, as if the conflict is external to the social relations we live under, as if the so-called terrorist group radicalizes the youth, not that the conditions of life inform and spur concern and outrage and resistance. Back to the Iraqi war, the US military called the civilian deaths collateral damage. Another nice frame. 500,000 children starved to death in Iraq, and Madeleine Albright said it was worth it. Well, what was it? What was worth it? It was the US interests, US corporate profit. Now they tell us pollution, destruction, the war in Afghanistan is worth it. Again, what is it? To make the world safe for corporate profit, continued extraction, continued destruction for their way of life. So we're at that moment. It's not been requested. We don't want it. You don't want it. We didn't ask for it. You don't ask for it. But externalities are part of social relations, right? Conflict, terrorism, and society. Society, all of these externalities are part of our global world. We're not separate from each other. We are not separate from nature. There's a Buddhist phrase that says, we are here to awaken from our illusion of separateness. If you allow me to quote from the Quran, there's a verse that says, do not commit abuse on the earth. Do not commit abuse on environment or humanity. Human life, healthy social relations among people requires radical change. We need to win public control and access to the media. We need public control over the military and police. We need public access to healthcare and education. We need public worker control over production practices and products. Perhaps replace cars with trains, turn the funding of the military into funding for education, housing, healthcare, music. We can recognize and reject the media frames that we've been given about the war and the environment. And we can create and construct a more humane world, together replacing production for profit with production for human needs and human survival. I'd be happy to take questions. I hope I left some time for us to have a few remarks and conversation. Again, thank you for inviting me. I hope to be with you next year.
Thank you so much, Professor Art. We really hope that you can be with us in person next year. We'll see how the pandemic conditions are going to evolve in the upcoming future. But even having you virtually as our keynote speaker was very nice. Thank you for the inspiring talk. So many thinking points, and we do have about 20 minutes for any questions and answers. Our participants can raise their hands if they want to ask a question, or if they prefer, they can write in the chat box, Q&A chat box on their screen. I'll take the initiative then. I do have a couple questions. Well, not really questions, but perhaps if you could speak more about one thing, and I wanna hear what you think about this other thing. So the first, and this will give time to our participants to write their questions. And the first thing is that so many thinking points about journalism, propaganda, and meaning making, so on and so forth. Not unique to the United States, but it's a wonderful case study for us to understand the framework that you're speaking about. So, making meaning, that meaning construction, right, by virtue of news in this case is, I mean, I think it's just possible by an alliance or cooperation between different institutions in society, right? One of which is media, and then there's politics, and there's the market. I mean, your last concluding remarks kind of answered this question, but so media, politics, and market, what other institutions are there to make this meaning construction for the benefit of the framers, if I'm making myself clear? I mean, I wanna really take you to the political economic aspects of this whole story, if you can.
Yeah, it's oftentimes in the US in particular, but in other places, there will be critiques of individual reporters, as if the individual reporter's political perspective is informing their news reporting. When you talk about political economy, it depends upon who owns that particular media outlet. If the New York Times owns that particular outlet, the publisher and then the news editor will assign somebody, and that becomes their assigned news reporting. You don't get to be assigned to that particular bureau or that particular news beat until you have demonstrated that you're capable of writing a good story, an accurate story. You have the skills to talk to different sources, and you can put that in some coherent frame. If you seem to be partisan or seem to always be challenging what is understood to be newsworthy, you're not going to get that promotion. You're not going to get moved to a different location. In almost every country, journalists are trained in educational institutions. So you have journalism programs at the university that trains students into what makes news. And you learn these categories. Well, news is what happens immediately, the recent, right? Because otherwise it's history, it's not news. News is dependent on how big it is. So one car crash isn't news, but 20 is. News depends upon how close or how it affects our readers. So at Purdue, the war in Iraq wasn't a story unless there was a student that was wounded in Iraq, and then it becomes front page story. So we have all of these categories that young journalists learn, and then they go out. Now, let's say I have a news story I have to give to my editor tomorrow. I've got one day, and I want to report on the bombing in Syria. I'm going to talk to the people that did the bombing because they should know, right? So I talk to the Pentagon, the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the White House. I may go to a press conference, but I don't have the time or the resources to talk to people in Syria. One, I can't go there because the rebel forces have killed journalists, so I can't go there. So I tend to go to those sources that are the most available and still considered legitimate. So when you mention politics, and I would say economics, both corporations and governments have PR offices. They have press secretaries. They put out fancy little press kits that give all the information. How would you find the information of a social group that's fighting for immigrant rights in the United States or Turkey? They don't have resources to hold a press conference to put out that information. So like I said, it's not a conspiracy or necessarily an intent to frame it in a particular way. It's, as you say, it's part of the political economy, the structure of those societies. But there is a presumed ideological stance that says, which is why the news reporters would have the flags on their lapel, and I'm sure it happens in Turkey, right? You need to demonstrate your bona fides that you support the Turkish culture, the Turkish way of life, the Turkish government policies. Otherwise, you're going to run into problems. So that also constrains what we can expect to see from the media. I don't know if that speaks directly to your question, but.
Yes, definitely. Thank you. It gives me more thinking points, but let me see if there are other people who want to ask questions. Okay, a couple questions, Leo Lin and Piotr, and then İrem Taşçıoğlu. Mine, can you just turn Leo's mic first?
Thank you, Professor Art. Thank you for your wonderful presentation and the insightful knowledge that you brought to us. So one simple question I would like to know about the fact check for the individual or investigative journalist, if they are stationed overseas, how do they do or perform the fact check responsibility before writing up a report? And then this is something that I'm not sure. So what's your perspective of the role of fact-checking in framing news from the reporter's perspective? Thank you.
Yeah, that's a very good question. We presume that any reporter is going to verify and validate the information that they've been given. I think that you will find one of the ways around that is to stick in the word alleged or presumed or apparent when you don't have evidence that, for instance, there was a chemical attack. The other thing is by relying upon official sources that are considered credible and acceptable to the publisher or to the news broadcasting news service, you don't have to do too much fact checking. If what you're saying fits the frame of what people have learned to believe and to understand, and you're not challenging that, what is there to check, right? Like if I say, Leo's a handsome, honest person, well, who's going to dispute that, right? So do I have evidence to show that? No, but people know that, Leo's a handsome, honest person. So when Leo speaks and he says, that building behind me isn't really there anymore, I will just say the building behind Leo no longer exists. What do I have to check? Because we all know that the White House or the Pentagon or the Joint Chiefs of Staff right? And if we get Macron and May and Trump all saying the same thing, well, it must be true. There's not a whole lot to go checking on. Now, however, if you go to a group that seems to challenge that, and this was one of the things in the New York Times article about the chemical attacks, some Russian ambassador said that the Britons were directly involved in a video construction that showed there was a chemical attack. And the New York Times in the very next sentence said they had no evidence to prove the claim. But as I said before, there were 20 some odd claims by all these other people that were not proven, but never once did they say what Trump said, what May said, what Macron said. There is no evidence to support their claims because their readers and their good patriotic citizens don't question their claims. Again, it's not a conspiracy, or it's more part of the cultural system, a particular way of doing things that we have learned to do and learned to expect.
Thank you.
Hi, thanks for your talk. I really enjoyed it. It really brought me back thinking about Noam Chomsky's propaganda model, the work that McChesney and Bagdikian have been doing for decades about the need for more public control. And I think Victor Pickard has a recent book on this as well, the kind of crisis of journalism. And of course, Lance Bennett's indexing theory speaks exactly to, the whole reliance on the military and government officials. I would push back a little bit, only to kind of, and I think you do this yourself by saying, this isn't a conspiracy, right? I mean, if you just look at the New York Times and you write in climate change in Syria, there's articles dating back to 2015 about climate change being a factor in leading to civil war in Syria, right? And there is reporting done on climate refugees. Granted, the New York Times is probably not the place that really kind of sparks these things. They might pick up the lead from someone else. But I guess my question for you is more, because I think that leads to kind of thinking about kind of the affordances of media in, not just thinking about it as economies of control, but also economies of opportunity. And I'd like to hear your thoughts about how you see digital media feeding into all this, right? Because, teaching students now who are not even old enough to remember 9/11, not only do they not remember 9/11, if I ask them who carried out 9/11, they have no idea. and this I teach in America, by the way. So, that's to say, column inches are interesting, but most of them don't get past the first couple columns anyway, right? So, and what's interesting about your talk about spectacle remind me of Henry Giroux's argument about these kind of workstations of fear, right? And he it overlaps with what you're saying really nicely. But what he argues is that it also allows violent groups to exploit that, right? If we're hungry for blood and gore and things of that sort, he argues kind of that's how ISIS kind of gets into our collective psyche, right? By exploiting the political economy of how our capitalist media works. So I wonder what your thoughts are on the promises and limitations of digital media, right? Because they're clearly controlled by corporations. There's algorithms. We've seen the problems of that in the US. But also there's clearly chances to be that there's less control, but there's also other types of more stealthy control. So I'm wondering how that fits into what you've been talking about today.
Oh, thanks, Beatar. You actually gave us several topics to talk about. The first thing I would say is yes, and I tried to mention that it's not that the Associated Press or New York Times or Le Monde don't write about climate, as you said, but when they write about climate, it's not about climate, it's about something else. The climate report is, well, the climate caused these refugees and the problem is these refugees, or the climate is the basis for the civil war and the problem is the civil war. The fact that the climate is changing and affecting all of human life does not become a front page story, right? The UN says this is the last generation. That should be on the front page. It's not on the front page. It will be there somewhere. Sometimes there's an editorial because they can't ignore what everyone sees around them. So I think the thing is even in the US, when we had the floods and the fires on the West Coast, they would write about that. And they would say this is in response to increasing heat on the planet, but it's not the lead story. The lead story is the lives that are lost, the firefighters that get scorched, the trees in the air, right? In other words, they look at the consequence, not the cause, which is precisely what most news media would say is their responsibility. As far as digital media or social media, I think it had at the beginning, it had a very, hopeful possibility that there would be more access for the average citizen to make their own news and to share their own news. But as you say, there's algorithms and there's also several corporations, everything from Baidu to Google, to Yahoo, to the rest, that pretty much dominate that through their algorithms and the way, even when you do a search, as you said. The other thing I would note is that none of these major social media players actually make or report news. They aggregate what the actual news media do. In fact, I think they've had a suit in Europe or Australia, maybe both, where the news media has sued Google and others for taking their work on news and then putting it on their websites without paying their permission, without paying for their permission to repost it. So a lot of it is that the algorithms interfere with our ability to do this. The other thing is that what does appear is usually created somewhere else off that particular social media site. Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, they don't make the news. They are showing us what other news forces have done. I also would note that the majority of people still get their news, 60% of the people in the US still get their news from television. And when we compare some of the sites, the New York Times has 7.5 million readers every day on their digital media site. So some of these ideas that the traditional news media have disappeared. There may be fewer print pages, but the Wall Street Journal, Washington Post, some of the major ones remain primary sources of news. The last thing you said, which could be a whole conversation, is how does somebody like ISIS exploit the political economy, the media that's trying to get readers and viewers, and they do that through spectacle. That's probably true. In my mind, that also indicates that ISIS is not representative of the general population. It's kind of like SDS. Todd Gitlin wrote about SDS, and SDS is trying to chase the media to get coverage, and they ended up having nothing but tactics of how to get media coverage. They had no program, they had no principle, they had no organization. It became nothing but a bunch of media actors, right? And I think your point about spectacle's true, and I think that the US and the EU governments know this. We can antagonize a terrorist group to respond, and then when they respond, we can blame them for our own response. I think just now about Houthis sending some little missile to Riyadh, and the Saudis said, look, they're attacking us. This is the reason we're at war. But they didn't do that until years after Saudi had been bombing the hell out of the Yemeni people. But when there was a response, that's what's going to cause our legitimate response. So it actually backfires. It plays in the hands of the others. It's kind of like in the US when Black Lives Matter protested after George Floyd's killing. 26 million people demonstrated. And that was the way that the news was reporting on it. Outrageous, racist killing, legitimate public response. But within 2 weeks, all of the news media in the US had shifted to say, look at these looters, look at these rioters. Okay, I mean, I think you could probably understand the outrage and the frustration of some people that would like to break a window of McDonald's. Really, that's self-defeating. And what it did was allow for the very crackdown on the demonstrations that were having some impact on shifting the political discussions in the United States. I realize none of those are an adequate answer. We'd have to talk for quite a while, but thank you, Piotr.
Thank you for this wonderful presentation. I think my question might be related to the last one on the representation of ISIS. In terms of the representation, how would you locate the Kurdish resistance within the very humanitarian framing of the conflicts? Because I got this idea that most of the humanitarian discourse is usually rooted in some kind of a victimization. But this time, it also goes through this idea of a fighter for democracy, Kurdish female fighter figure versus the barbaric terrorists. Like this framing of the very opposing sides, I think complicates the picture of this humanitarian victimization a bit. Like it's more in terms of today, barbarism versus democracy or so on. So how would you think this Kurdish resistance figure would complicate the picture of humanitarianism?
Well, I think any discussion about Kurdish is complicated no matter what entry point we have to it. When we think about nations, nation states, and the relationship between language, culture, and a people, historically that has led to the foundation of a nation. The Kurds do not have a nation. So the Kurds, whether you want to accept them as a nation state in vitro, so to speak, or if you want to understand them primarily as an ethnic group, they are spread over several countries. And they have very little political influence, except in a few of the cities where their political representatives have the local political power, whether that might be the city council or the mayoral. And then, as you say, it gets complicated because they are in I would say, a very low, powerful position. They have looked on occasion for allies outside themselves that they thought might bring them some support. I think it was misguided. My own opinion would be it was misguided to look to the US to be the ones that would champion their cause for democracy and freedom in a nation. It's the US simply was using the Kurds the same way that they've used the democratic forces in Syria against Assad. And then again, as in almost any place where any nascent national state has tried to appear, there's been a variety of methods to do that. Some have been like a Gandhi, where we're going to do nonviolent civil disobedience on a mass scale. Others will be like Frelimo in Africa, and we're going to physically fight the South African forces. In the case of Kurds, there's divisions, right? I know that there's a Kurdish party in Turkey that runs in the elections and wants to have negotiations and political discussions. On the other hand, there's Kurdish forces in Turkey and in Syria and in Iraq that want nothing to do with that, it's almost like a Maoist thing, power comes through the barrel of a gun. So to be able to make a blanket statement about the Kurdish demands is difficult if you're going to align with one or another of the political perspectives and the strategic orientations, which I would say does not detract from support for self-determination for any ethnicity or nationality. How that comes about and under what conditions that might be, again, I think that's a whole, that could be a whole weekend conference to talk about that. So I don't want to avoid this, but I don't want to go too far afield from what I was expecting to talk about or for the topic for today. But thank you for that.
Well, it's unfortunate that we are out of time. We just got, into the conversation, but it's over. But thank you so much, Professor Arts, for being with us here today, though virtually. And thank you, everyone, for joining us and participating with your questions and comments. This is the end of our keynote session in the first day of the 9th ICCTS. I kind of like saying the 9th because it's, it's 9th. I leave it to you, Mine, now for the announcements for tomorrow.
Thank you very much, Professor Arts, for your remarkable contribution. I also thank Professor Koçer for moderating such a great session. And now we came to the end of today's sessions. On behalf of the Kadir Has University, I would like to thank all the speakers, moderators, and attendees. Your contributions ensured such a strong and dynamic conference today. Tomorrow, we will continue with 2 important sessions, and we hope to see you here with us again. Thank you, and have a nice day.
Thank you, everyone. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you.